On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler initiated Operation Barbarossa, Germany's assault on the Soviet Union. It marked the start of a campaign that would ultimately decide the Second World War. At first, the Germans achieved remarkable success. The panzers pushed ahead, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were killed or captured in massive encirclement battles. Germany appeared to be on the verge of another significant victory, but the Soviet Union did not collapse as expected, and despite horrific losses, their determination to fight stayed strong. German casualties rose as they came painfully close to reaching Moscow, just 20 miles short of their goal. The Soviets launched a sudden counteroffensive, forcing the Germans onto the back foot. It was Hitler's first defeat on land in the Second World War. But how did it occur? Why did Operation Barbarossa come so near to triumph before failing at the final hurdle? Well, before we answer that question, a reminder to subscribe to the Imperial War Museum's YouTube channel for more content just like this every 2 weeks. Invasion plans. Adolf Hitler starts planning to attack the Soviet Union as early as July 1940, before the Battle of Britain even takes place. Even back in Mein Kampf, during the mid-1920s. He's plotting to strike the Soviet Union. This is set to be the battlefield on which National Socialism's ideology either prevails or collapses. One of the principles of that ideology was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. The creation of a Germanic Aryan empire in Eastern Europe that would provide the resources needed for having conquered France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks. Germany was certain of seizing that land from the Soviet Union. Hitler believed that communist society was inherently weak, and that it wouldn't take much to crush it. His well-known quote was that all we've got to do is kick the door in, and the whole structure will come crumbling down. The Germans are not only preparing for a rapid Blitzkrieg campaign that's intended to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in 6 to 8 weeks, but they require a quick victory. They can't endure a slow grinding war, because there aren't enough reserves of manpower and equipment to turn this into a prolonged conflict. We need to win swiftly. To secure that victory, Germany gathered over 3 million men, the largest invasion force in the history of warfare up to that point. 3 army groups moved toward 3 separate targets. Army Group North advancing for Leningrad, Army Group Center aiming for Moscow, and Army Group South pushing for Kyiv. The entire strategy is a continuation of the Blitzkrieg concept that's been so effective in France, which is that you win by avoiding prolonged fighting. If you want to learn more about Blitzkrieg and how it operates, I've put a link to our video on the topic in the description. Phase 1. When the operation began, on the 22nd of June, 1941, those tactics worked flawlessly. The advance, surpassing all expectations. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured as German tanks surged through the Soviet lines. The Germans opened the campaign by essentially wiping out the Soviet Air Force on the ground. They caught them off guard. The Soviet Air Force was practically destroyed. This allowed the German army to maneuver freely across the battlefield, driving deep into the Russian interior and surrounding the frontier forces. The Soviet army was taken utterly by surprise and had not been able to reinforce their new border. In Poland, while Stalin's purges of the Soviet officer corps left his army poorly commanded, whereas in the Battle of France the French and British armies would see themselves just about to be cut off and would decide, oh, time to retreat. The Soviet armies are so slow, so badly organized, that they don't have time to pull back. They get surrounded, completely cut off, hundreds of thousands of men. However, there is an issue. German halt by the time they reached this stage. Germany expected to have destroyed the Russian field armies, and that the remaining push towards Moscow would be more of a parade than an actual battle. But the Germans had badly underestimated the size of the Soviet army. They were going to invade with about 3 million men and expected the total Soviet force to be roughly the same. Whereas in reality, By Christmas 1941, German armies had captured 3 million Soviet soldiers, and they were still fighting. Those massive distances covered by the German panzers made them increasingly difficult to supply, while Soviet troops unexpectedly kept fighting. So actually, these huge encirclements behind the German lines became a real problem, in that they could now attack into the German supply routes and cut them off from the front line. So at this moment, Hitler said, well, hang on, stop single quotes. Despite protests from the German generals, Army Group Center stopped its advance on Moscow and shifted to the left and right to help destroy the Soviet pockets that were still resisting, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops in massive battles of annihilation. By mid-September, the Soviet field armies were finally finished, and the push on Moscow could resume. This pause to look back and clear the rear, to allow everyone to catch up, gave breathing space for the Soviets to redefine their front line and bring up more units into position, digging in before Moscow. So now there was a completely fresh defensive line that the Germans had to break through when they restarted the offensive. Phase 2, and that wasn't the only issue for Germany. Though these new troops were undersupplied and undertrained, new shipments were beginning to arrive from Britain. Many of these divisions didn't have uniforms, they were just in civilian clothing. Some divisions even had to share rifles, as there weren't enough to go around. At the same time, the first Arctic convoys were arriving in Murmansk, and Archangel bringing aid from Britain, providing just enough equipment for the Soviets to stay in the field. On top of that, the Soviets had successfully moved their factories from in front of the advancing Germans to the Ural Mountains. That meant war production was actually ramping up, and they were able to get more tanks, like the new T-34, into the front line. Worst of all, though, was the rapidly worsening Russian weather. Through October comes the Soviet autumn. So what happens is you get snowfalls, thaw, snowfall, thaw, and it turns into a completely muddy morass across all of central Russia. The German offensive begins to slow to a halt, both because they are running into this unexpected defensive line, plus the Soviet weather is causing delays, plus the fact that most German units, especially the armored formations at the spears tip, are now down to about 50% strength. They get to within 20 kilometers of Moscow, and by then, the weather has turned completely. It's now full-blown Soviet winter. By the end of November, you've got more German soldiers in hospital with frostbite than you have with injuries. The offensive was finished, but looking at the bigger picture as Barbarossa came to a standstill for this German advance, Germany still appeared to be in a strong position. Army Group North was convinced that the besieged Leningrad was about to fall. Army Group Center stood at the gates of Moscow, and Army Group South had taken Ukraine and Kiev. When the new year arrived, they planned to complete the job. However, little did they know, the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve. Soviet counterattack. They had managed to move the majority of those Russian divisions which were on the eastern side of the Soviet Union, those that had been facing Mongolia and the Japanese, because they'd learned that the Japanese were not going to attack. These weren't inexperienced, untrained troops. These were proper Soviet field divisions, and many of them had been trained for winter combat because they came from Siberia. Unlike the worn-out Germans they would be facing, these soldiers had winter camouflage and weapons that could function in the extreme cold. On December 6th they counterattacked, and they launched this massive Soviet counteroffensive in front of the gates of Moscow, catching the Germans completely off guard and forcing them into a retreat. That was the end of Barbarossa. Conclusion: Hitler's ideological belief that Soviet society would collapse when they kicked the door in could not have been further from reality. The Germans needed a swift victory, but the Soviets had managed to stay in the fight and turn the Blitzkrieg Barbarossa into a war of production. The Germans were now being pushed into a war of attrition, a long, grueling, slow conflict in the Soviet interior in this case, during wintertime, and things were looking grim for the Germans because they didn't have the manpower and resources to match the Soviet armies 1-to-1. despite Barbarossa's failure to crush the Soviets quickly. A new German offensive began in 1942, under Hitler's direct orders. The target was the Caucasus in the south, and a city called Leningrad. The German generals wanted to continue the drive on Moscow, but Hitler insisted that Germany needed the oil fields in Azerbaijan to fuel their armies. Though his generals didn't fully grasp it, Hitler had now accepted this was a war of attrition and resources, whether he liked it or not.